Hey guys, it's Mathel here once again, and having played Cast on Crit Dark Pact for a couple of days now on the Occultist character, I can make probably just a few little conclusions, or at least talking points about how the playstyle of the character is, and especially compared to the self-cast version of Dark Pact builds. First and foremost, it seems to play pretty damn nicely. I've been enjoying it, and I rather play this than the self-cast version after trying out self-cast for a bit, even though self-cast does feel better on some situations, like especially bosses. But bosses over here have not been too bad. This is a Death and Taxes that Zana's given me, level 78 or something, and you can still do some decent single target and bosses, even without the Vile Summon Skeletons setup going. But the Vile Summon Skeletons helps us on single target a lot and pretty much helps us take care of any bosses we come across whilst mapping. I think once we hit tier 16s it'll definitely be pretty damn shit, and at that point I think I'll have to single target with my self-cast setup. But from what I can tell, the cast on crit setup for me is much more enjoyable to map with. Even when I'm using a bright beacon going super fast on the self-cast version, I just feel the cast on crit version is a little bit smoother for me, a little bit safer at times, and just overall more enjoyable with the playstyle, rather than having to shield charge and then just self-cast over and over again, sometimes getting stunned, sometimes putting yourself in bad situations. The cast on crit one, you just shield charge around and do little cyclones here or there whilst exploding large portions of the screen. Now I am showing you little bits and pieces of the self-cast setup here as well as the cast on crit. This here is the self-cast against double boss Hort, and yeah, it seems to go well enough, but I have to do a lot of face tanking here, and it's kinda sketchy not being stun immune, even with the Brine King Pantheon. It's just, once it wears off, you kind of get stunned a couple times in a row, and then you're totally fucked. But this was a fairly dangerous one. I think it had poison and double bosses, and you know, the DPS there is good, especially on a 4-link. As you can see, I'm only using for the self-cast setup, running dual Apeps in the weapon swap. It is still pretty damn nice DPS and has a lot of potential for going higher. Currently the character isn't really well positioned or built for self-cast, because you probably need some stun immunity and maybe even a larger health pool. At the moment I don't really have either of those, because most of my performance so far has been on cast on crit Cyclone, where I don't think I need as much health or as much stun immunity, because we are of course Cyclone. And I think were I to fully suss out both versions of the character, I would have to play them a bit more and do a lot more testing. At this stage I can say that Occultist, Crit, Dark Pact, definitely viable in both forms. Just figuring out which one's better for which part is going to be a bit more extensive testing. Overall, I think the cast on crit is pretty damn solid for clearing and enjoyable for clearing, while the self-cast should just be better all around everywhere except for the feel of the character. You may enjoy the feel of cast on crit Cyclone Dark Pact a bit more, like I think I do anyway at this stage. And I'm not really too sure I'm going to be recommending this build just yet, but if you want to play it, I did go over the general setup in the previous video, and I do want to go over a few little tidbits right now, because there are a few little important things to go over, some of which I've never really used or even talked about before, like the Immortal Call setup. So specifically what I'm talking about there in that example is Immortal Call with increased duration and Arcane Surge. Typically my Arcane Surge would be attached to a Orb of Storms if I need it, and a Power Charge on crit setup, but that's not really necessary as an Occultist, because we have all our Power Charge on crit taken care of here, and Orb of Storms doesn't really serve a purpose. But apparently Immortal Call's increased duration based off of the endurance charges works for Arcane Surge as well. So just a default Immortal Call with Arcane Surge and increased duration attached is a 7-second Arcane Surge. However, when you go and kill some shit and earn yourself 3 endurance charges like so, and then press your Immortal Call, it lasts, you know, a 2-second buff for Immortal Call, but the Arcane Surge lasts about 22 seconds in my current form, because it is getting the benefit of the buff duration per endurance charge. So it's a really nifty and convenient way of keeping up Arcane Surge on a caster for pretty extended periods of time, especially if you're running a Blasphemy Warlord's Mark, which this occultist basically has to do to get some level of sustain for our leech. So that's why we have a Warlord's Mark attached to Blasphemy, and it gives us endurance charges quite often, a lot of the times. Every time I have to press my Immortal Call, which is like once every 10, 15, 20 seconds or so, I will have a 20-second buff of Arcane Surge, which is 13% more spell damage and a bit of mana regen, which doesn't really help too much, but it does help us keep at our maximum of 52 mana for the shield charging. Besides that, since the last video, the character has progressed quite a bit. It is now level 87. I'm still using the same Vegan dagger, though at this point I crafted a nice spell damage shield with crit for spells, and turns out these types of shields are really expensive to buy. So I just crafted it with alt regaling. You try and get a big spell damage roll and then maybe a crit roll, and regal, or just a big spell damage roll, and then anything, regal, and then get a crafted life. Overall, it's going to be hard to buy anything at this level for cheap, so I do think alt regaling is probably the safest way to try and get a good shield. The alternative, however, is just wearing a Lycosidae, and instead of running a Vegan dagger, running some sort of caster dagger that has a bit of attack speed and crit as well. You just don't really have to look for a Vegan dagger that way, and it can be a better option than running a Vegan dagger plus a shield if you go Lycosidae plus a good caster dagger instead. Besides that, I bought myself 40% Dark Pact Star Conjure. Star Conjure is pretty good just for life, attack speed, crit, and because I don't really need resists otherwise. Tried to fill out life everywhere I could as much as possible, which is why I'm running this belt instead of the untethered belt, because even though that one has better output for damage and all that, I can't really justify losing 150 life from a belt or so, and I think this is just a stronger option. And then some crit multi, spell damage, life sort of neck, and 2 diamond rings just so we can fill out some crit a lot easier on the build. Zeri Flask gives us most of our leech, and then Diamond Flask of course for a lot of our crit, and I'm tossing up between my 5th link here. So currently the 4 link is definitely Cyclone, Void Manip, Cast on Crit, Dark Pact in the Covenant, which is a large damage buff for a chest. And then the 5th link is either Crit Strikes, it's sometimes increased area, it's sometimes added lightning for the shocking, and it's sometimes crit damage. But for the single target, it is definitely Conk Effect whenever you're ready for that. And the 6th link is, I don't know yet, still possibly going to be tossing up between all of these. Could also be Controlled Destruction, which is supposed to be the highest damage gem to put there, but I don't really want the reduced crit chance, especially when playing cast on crit and needing reliable amounts of crit. So that's the entire gear setup. An important thing to note is Vaal Summon Skeletons attached to minion life when doing the cast on crit setup is a huge amount of extra single target. Whenever you pop this for your bosses, the Dark Pact will chain off of you and do plenty of extra damage onto the bosses, while chaining onto the Vaal Summon Skeletons. So as long as they're alive, you can see a very noticeable increase in your DPS against the bosses, but some bosses kill your Vaal Summons really quickly, and then it doesn't really do anything there anyway. So as far as the cast on crit setup goes, that's roughly all I need to cover. I am trying to get as much life as possible still. My next few points are probably going there and there, and I should hit about 6k life, though the more the merrier, try and get more. I haven't got any on my jewels yet because they are all just damage jewels. It's hard to get ones with life. If you can do so, then by all means do, because it's pretty damn valuable on a jewel slot. It's just hard to get. The actual non-cast on crit setup, though, from what I've figured out to be best, is probably running a Bright Beak. You do put Spell Echo in place of your Cyclone probably, and instead of cast on crit, you chuck something like a Crit Strikes in, and then you'll have a very reliable shield charging with your Bright Beak, which is super fast, and then really reliable casting of your Dark Pact with the Spell Echo. Now it drains you super fast, especially when you start casting very quickly with your Vaal Haste and everything. So you got to bear in mind with that you probably won't be able to sustain very well against most things unless you have your Zeri Flask up. So against bosses, you may find yourself porting out and resetting your flasks often. And then ultimately, if you have the setup the way I do with your shield charge, fortify faster attacks in your shield, and then in your weapon you have summon ice golem, vile summon skeletons, and minion life, you can do an easy quick swap against bosses with dual apex, which is a huge damage increase. As you can see here, just in this budget ass, meaningless 3-link, who cares at this point. When we're running around with just this setup over here, you have 19k DPS, dual apex takes you up to 35. So it's roughly double. All you need is really at least 1 apex for the setup to go good if you still want to run a shield. But yeah, sometimes for the self-cast setup, I feel it's better to just shield charge around, and that's how you clear, because it's a lot faster that way. When you come across something you want to really burn down quickly, you have to bust out your apex and go super fast with the damage on it. Overall, that's all I have to share for the character for now. In the next day or two, I will be trying out the higher tier maps and then Guardians and all that. I think, as I mentioned, the cast on crit setup probably won't be able to do tier 16s very well, if at all, the bosses that is, whereas the self-cast setup shouldn't have too many problems, but we'll come to those problems when we get there and see what we can do about them. For now though guys, this has been a CoC DP update. I hope you enjoyed the video, found it informative or something like that, and I'll see you next time.